So, what if you tried to stop a country from falling to one ideology, but in doing so, you enabled the slaughter of up to 1 million of its people? Today, we're going to dig into one of the 20th century's biggest and yet most overlooked mass killings. And we're going to see what it tells us about the absolutely catastrophic consequences of foreign intervention.
This quote right here, it perfectly captures the tragic irony we're exploring. It's a paradox you see again and again in history, right? A powerful nation reaches in to try and steady a situation and instead just shatters it completely. So how does that happen? Well, that's what we're here to find out.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll break down this whole idea of the intervention paradox. Then, we'll jump in our time machine back to Indonesia in the 1960s to see it all play out. We're talking the political tensions, the one event that lit the fuse, and the unbelievable violence that followed. We'll also dig into the role foreign powers played, before we zoom back out to really understand the legacy of all this.
All right, let's dive right in. The intervention paradox isn't just some fancy academic term. It's a story that plays out over and over again. Think about places like Vietnam or Iraq. A big, powerful nation steps in, thinking it can shape events, get the outcome it wants. But history shows us again and again, the real outcome almost never matches the plan.
And this right here, this gets to the why. Why do these things go so wrong? Well, it usually starts with a total misread of the situation on the ground. Foreign powers, they parachute in and all they see is a simple black and white fight. They treat real people, leaders, rebels, everyday folks, like they're just pawns on a global chessboard, totally ignoring their own histories and motivations. They just don't get that when you mess with a country's balance, you're not just flipping a switch, you're lighting a fuse. And maybe most important of all, they underestimate how powerful their own support is. Their money, their weapons, their political blessing, it's not just help, it's a green light. It gives local forces permission to do the absolute worst.
So, with that idea in our heads, let's turn to our case study, which might be one of the most chilling examples of this paradox in action. We're going to Indonesia in the mid-1960s. Now, at the time, this was a massively important nation. Huge population, tons of resources, and in a really strategic spot. And the whole thing was being held together by its founder, President Sukarno.
Suharto knew his country was basically a powder keg of different groups who did not trust each other. So he came up with this system he called guided democracy. And honestly, it was less a government and more a political high-wire act. Suharto himself was the guy on the tightrope, just trying to keep his balance between three powerful and deeply suspicious factions, all pulling him in different directions.
And who were these three forces? Well, on one side you had the powerful, very nationalistic military. On the other, you had influential Islamic groups, a huge force in society. And then, right in the middle, and getting stronger every single day, was the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party. And this is a key detail. The PKI wasn't some tiny fringe group. It was the third largest communist party in the entire world, with millions of members, all operating completely legally.
And that is what got Washington and its allies very, very nervous. You gotta remember, this is the absolute peak of the Cold War. The West was obsessed with the domino theory, this fear that if one nation fell to communism, the whole region would just collapse like, well, dominoes. And from that point of view, a huge, popular, and legal communist party in a country as important as Indonesia, that wasn't just a problem. It was an absolute nightmare scenario.
So you have this incredibly tense situation, this fragile balance, and then, on one single night, that balance was just shattered. This was the spark that lit the fuse on that powder keg.
It all went down on the night of September 30th, 1965. A pretty mysterious group of junior officers, calling themselves the September 30th Movement, kidnapped and then murdered 6 of Indonesia's top army generals. Their motive? Well, they claimed they were trying to stop a CIA-backed coup. In all that chaos, one man saw a huge opportunity: Major General Suharto. He moved fast, crushed the movement, and seized total control of the military. And then, he made the move that changed everything. He blamed the entire conspiracy on the PKI. Now, it's really important to say that historians still debate how involved the PKI actually was, but in that moment, the truth didn't matter. The accusation was all the justification Suharto needed.
And what came next, it wasn't just locking people up. It wasn't just political suppression. It was a calculated, systematic campaign of annihilation that just swept across the country.
Just take a second and look at this number. Up to 1 million people murdered in less than a year. Just let that sink in for a second. This wasn't a war between armies. No, this was a purge.
It was carried out by the Indonesian military, sure, but also by civilian militias and paramilitary groups who were often armed and trained by the army itself.
And the net they cast was terrifyingly wide. Yeah, it started with actual communists, but it spread so fast to anyone just suspected of being a sympathizer. Teachers, union leaders, artists, intellectuals, anyone seen as left-leaning was a target. The violence also took on this horrifying ethnic angle, with many ethnic Chinese Indonesians being targeted. And in the middle of all this frenzy, the anti-communist banner became a cover for just settling old scores and personal feuds. Just being accused was a death sentence.
And this quote, it just gives you this gut punch of an image of how bad it was. This wasn't happening in some secret camps. This was out in the open, in villages and towns. Neighbors were killing neighbors. Bodies were just dumped in rivers so often that, they were said to have run red. And the whole thing was framed as this patriotic, almost sacred duty to cleanse the nation.
So how does this all circle back to our theme of foreign intervention? Well, because this wasn't just some domestic issue. The Indonesian military was not acting alone. It had powerful international backers who saw this horrific purge as a strategic win.
And this slide, wow, it just lays it all out, doesn't it? The official goal of powers like the US, the UK, and Australia was simple: contain communism. But what they actually did went way beyond that. Declassified documents have since confirmed they gave the Indonesian army lists of suspected communists, basically kill lists. They provided diplomatic cover at the UN, just downplaying the violence. They even ran propaganda operations to make the PKI look evil and make the army's actions seem legitimate.
This quote right here is taken directly from declassified U.S. diplomatic cables, and it shows you exactly how this was all seen behind closed doors. Officials on the ground weren't horrified. They were reporting the mass killings back to Washington with approval. They called the extermination of hundreds of thousands of human beings a positive development. From where they sat, it was simply a win in the Cold War.
So, let's be super clear here. The US and its allies didn't give a direct order to start the killings, but all their support sent a message to Suharto and the army that was impossible to misunderstand. Do what you gotta do, we've got your back, there won't be any consequences. That outside approval, that green light, it just emboldened the killers and poured gasoline on the fire.
Okay, so let's look at the aftermath. From a cold, hard, geopolitical point of view, the purge worked. The PKI was gone. Indonesia was now firmly in the Western camp. But what kind of country was left standing in the ashes? What was the real price of this so-called stability?
Well, the answer was the new order. Suharto cemented his power and created a military-backed dictatorship that would rule Indonesia with an iron fist for the next 32 years. It was a regime literally born from blood, and it stayed in power through fear. Any dissent was crushed. History was completely rewritten to paint the army as heroes, and for generations, the survivors and their families were just forced into silence.
And this, right here, is the ultimate result of the intervention paradox in this case. The goal was to stop one ideology, communism. But what they got wasn't freedom or democracy, nope. The result was just swapping it for another form of domination, a long-lasting, repressive, authoritarian state that became a key ally to the West.
So, what are the hard lessons here? Well, the first is that terror isn't just a tool of revolutionaries. The forces of order can unleash it on an even more horrific scale. Second, that foreign intervention doesn't need boots on the ground to be deadly. A quiet nod of approval and some supplies can be just as powerful. Third, once you unleash mass violence, you can't control it. It takes on a monstrous life of its own. And finally, maybe the most chilling lesson of all, what looks like a geopolitical success from thousands of miles away is often a human catastrophe up close.
You know, despite the mind-boggling death toll, this is still a hidden chapter of the Cold War for so many people in the West. It's a brutal reminder that this global conflict wasn't just about missiles and spies in Berlin. It was fought in villages and rivers, and it left scars on millions of ordinary people, and on their children and their grandchildren. And so we're left with this unavoidable conclusion. The story of Indonesia in 1965, it's not some one-off event. It's a tragic, perfect case study in a pattern we see throughout history. A foreign power thinks it can control things from a distance. It promises stability. It promises order. But in the end, all it delivers is repression.